This is Mary Margaret Isbell, and for my Psych 360 History and Systems of Psychology oral presentation project, I've chosen to profile Hermann von Helmholtz. And I believe that you can sum up Hermann von Helmholtz in basically 3 words if you wanted to. He was intelligent, innovative, and inventive. And here I have a quote from him, which is also a really nice summary of his personality. He said, "The originator of a new concept finds, as a rule, that it's much more difficult to find out why other people do not understand him than it was to discover the new truth." Just a few fun facts about Hermann von Helmholtz. He was born August 31st, 1821, and he died September 8th, 1894, just 1 week and 1 day after turning 73. Helmholtz was a Virgo, like me, and Virgos generally are intellectual types who love precision and perfection. They're self-sufficient and self-directed, but they can become highly critical when the same is not found in those around them. And just a little FYI, John Locke was also a Virgo. Helmholtz was a great lover of art and music, and it's believed that his father inspired and cultivated those loves. And he was also an expert pianist, and for future reference, he never took a formal math class. Helmholtz grew up in Potsdam, Prussia, in the German Empire, near Berlin. And today, Potsdam is really more like a neighborhood or a suburb of Berlin. When he was young, he was a sickly child, and he suffered from dizzy spells and migraines. So his parents kind of kept him home a lot when he was little, and his father educated him there. He was a very curious and intelligent child, and his father taught him Latin, Greek, French, Italian, Hebrew, and Arabic. And also taught him about philosophy. His father was a philosopher who taught at the Potsdam Gymnasium, and he instilled a love of philosophy and learning in Helmholtz. He taught him the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and one of his other favorites, J.G. Fichte. And as it just so happened, J.G. Fichte's son, Emanuel Fichte, was a personal friend of the Helmholtz family and spent a lot of time in the house. And so Hermann was able to observe his father and Emanuel Fichte discussing philosophy, and this sort of impassioned him to also love philosophy. Believe it or not, all of this homeschooling from his father occurred before the age of 8. His formal education began at 8 when he was allowed to enter the Potsdam Gymnasium where his father taught. And he stayed there through graduation and then wanted to move on to university to study science, but his father couldn't afford it. So instead, he convinced Hermann to pursue medical school, specifically the Royal Friedrich Wilhelm Institute of Medicine and Surgery. And at that time, the German government had an agreement with the medical school where they would pay for a student's education if that student would agree to become an army doctor upon graduation. And that's the program that Helmholtz went for. And it's really similar to what our U.S. government offers through the U.S. Armed Forces today. They will agree to pay for some med schools as long as graduates come out and they work for the Army. So while Helmholtz was in medical school, he studied under Johann Muller, who developed the theory of specific nerve energies. And Helmholtz was his student and his lab assistant. But he also extended Muller's research, and he invented what he called the myograph, and that was a device that allowed him to measure the speed of neural impulses. And that research allowed him to go on and determine the speed of reaction time. Now, his official employment after he obviously served as an army surgeon for several years. When his servitude was over, he was hired as a teacher at the Academy of Fine Arts in Berlin, and there he taught anatomy. He held that job for 1 year until he was offered an assistant professorship at the Königsberg Physiological Institute, and there he taught anatomy and physiology for the next 6 years. In 1855, he was offered a job as a professor of anatomy and physiology at the University of Bonn, and he held that position for 3 years until he moved on to the University of Heidelberg, where he was a professor of physiology. And one of his most famous students while he was there was Wilhelm Wundt, and Wilhelm Wundt was also his lab assistant. So that's where he developed a lot of his research techniques, which eventually became the foundation for experimental psychology. There he stayed for 13 years until in 1871 he was offered the job as the chair of the physics department at the University of Berlin. And this was a position that he held until his death. But in 1887, he added on a second position, and he held both until he died. The second position was the director of the Physico-Technical Institute, which I think is right outside of Berlin, or still right there in the same general area. Helmholtz's major areas of study and research: first, in medical school, his focus was on nerve impulses, and he invented the myograph. I have a little picture of it here to the right. And he specifically studied on frogs, and he would stimulate the frog's leg and time as the impulse traveled down the frog's leg. He was able to time the neural impulse. And you can see the little frog there on the table. I assume he is not alive. That would seem cruel. I think he's passed away there. But he used this research and his invention to also go on and define the speed of reaction time. After med school and after his army service, he started to teach, but he also became interested in the human eye, and his focus was specifically on the retina, but he found it very hard to study properly because he didn't have the equipment that he needed, so he invented it. And his first invention was the ophthalmoscope, and you can see the top right picture there. That's an early version of it, and a doctor looking at someone's retina. And the ophthalmoscope allowed observation of the retina, and a version of it is still used today by eye doctors. The picture below shows a later prototype, but still nothing close to what we use today. His second invention was the ophthalmometer, and it measured the curvature of the eye. And he used these two devices in his research, and a theory of color vision proposed by Young, and he expanded on that and developed what's now known as the Young-Helmholtz theory, and that helps ophthalmologists understand color blindness. After he tired of studying the human eye, he went on to study the human ear. And it's believed that it was his love of music and his musicianship that inspired him to really want to understand how we hear and how the inner ear works. And he was able to accurately describe the bones inside the inner ear and how sound waves travel in, and how those waves are turned into the perception of hearing. Beyond that, he wanted to understand how pitch and tone are distinguished, specifically complex sounds like music, and he invented the Helmholtz resonator. And you can see that that's two pictures of it to the side. The top one is kind of the drawing and the formula of how it works, how sound waves travel in, how they resonate. And the bottom picture is an actual set of Helmholtz resonators. And you can see the varying sizes are able to identify the pitches and tones of different sounds, different complex sounds. So, studying the ear, then in his spare time, he studied mathematics. And if you'll remember, I said that he never took a formal math class. This is just what he did in his spare time by reading the works of Laplace, Biot, and Bernoulli. And he was particularly interested in how to marry his love of physics and mathematics and energy into one. And by studying these three subjects together, he came up with the law of conservation of energy. And basically, that law states that energy cannot spontaneously generate or disappear. It has to either be used or released as heat. And that law still stands today. When he moved on to be the chair at the University of Berlin, he basically dedicated the rest of his years to physics, specifically with a focus on electrodynamics, hydrodynamics, thermodynamics, and eventually meteorology. And while there were no major inventions during this time, he did inspire the next generation of innovators and researchers. One in particular was Heinrich Hertz, who you may know as the first person to demonstrate electromagnetic radiation. And there's also an invention known as the Helmholtz coils, and it's an electromagnetic device that basically is named after him, although there is some debate as to whether or not he invented it or he just inspired its invention. And I couldn't find a definitive answer either way. Those coils are still used today, and when used in a series, they produce a very uniform field of electromagnetic energy. So, to recap, his major inventions: the myograph, the ophthalmoscope, the ophthalmometer. The one I didn't have a picture of was a lab motor, which he used to electrically power laboratory equipment, and the Helmholtz resonators. In conclusion, I would say that pretty much every branch of science would like to claim Hermann von Helmholtz as a founding father, because his passion for science and learning is absolutely unsurpassed. He did groundbreaking research with lasting impact in mathematics, physics, physiology, and psychology. His contributions to specifically psychology as a science and its early development, most importantly, was his study of the psychology of perception. Beyond that, his study of nerves and neural impulses was kind of the foundation of neuroscience. And then his research in Heidelberg with Wundt as his lab assistant and his student went on to inspire Wundt's experimental psychology. And Helmholtz's measurement of reaction time has been used in innumerable psychological studies in the past and still today. So, here's what I'll leave you with, a little food for thought. Is it possible for someone today to research, study, learn, innovate, and invent to the extent that Helmholtz did in his day? Or have our advances in research and technology rendered us incapable of such focus because we've become too reliant on and also distracted by our own progress? I don't have the answer, but I would love to know what you think. And that is the end of my lecture on Hermann von Helmholtz. Thanks.